In 1066, the entire history of England pivoted upon the successful invasion of Duke William of Normandy, whom we now call William the Conqueror. But the politics of power are complex, and after his death, his realm fell into instability as his sons fought over their father's kingdom. And just as it seemed as if that realm would find peace and stability, once again united under a single king, another event in 1120 brought instability again, years of instability that would give rise to the House Plantagenet, which would rule England until 1485. It was a disaster that reverberates throughout history, one of those moments upon which history turns. The tragedy of the White Ship is history that deserves to be remembered. After his victory at the Battle of Hastings, William spent years completing the Norman conquest of England and fighting both on the continent and in England against foes both foreign and domestic. He faced revolts by the recently conquered, raids by the Danes, opposition from the French king and the would-be English king Edgar Atheling. William the Conqueror died in 1087 while on campaign in France, at the age of 59. William had 3 surviving sons at his death. The eldest was Robert, followed by William II, and the youngest, Henry. The practice of giving the kingdom only to the eldest son was not well entrenched at the time, and William followed an earlier tradition that split the kingdom between his heirs. Robert received the lands that William had gotten from his own father, Normandy. William II, also called William Rufus, received the newly conquered kingdom of England. Henry received money and some of his mother's holdings in England. But as still can happen today, immediately the heirs started fighting over their father's inheritance. Both Robert and William II immediately started preparing for war against each other, each seeking to claim the other's part of their father's kingdom. Henry, youngest of the 3, was caught in the middle. He initially stayed in Normandy with Robert, likely because Robert extorted him by threatening to withhold the monetary part of his inheritance. Taking advantage of the situation, William II seized the holdings meant for Henry in England. Henry supported Robert with money in exchange for becoming a count, but Robert didn't trust Henry and soon had him arrested, convinced by an advisor who thought Henry was conspiring with William. He was released, but did not receive the countship back. When William helped instigate a rebellion by a noble in Normandy in 1090, Henry supported Robert, and it was Henry's forces that won the day. He had the rebellious noble killed by tossing him off a castle. Henry gained significant fame for his actions in the battle, which only made Robert jealous. In repayment for protecting his realm, Robert banished Henry from Normandy, most likely because Robert felt Henry was becoming too popular, but possibly because Henry pressed his brother to give him back his title of count. In 1091, William Rufus invaded Normandy with an army large enough to convince Robert to give up his claim on the English throne. Instead, both vowed to support each other's claims to their own lands and named each other as heirs, specifically leaving Henry out of the succession of either country. Both of the brothers then turned on Henry, taking control of his lands in Normandy. But politics in the High Middle Ages were never static, and William and Robert started fighting again. This time Henry sided with William, who supported Henry in taking his lands back to weaken Robert. Henry became a fixture at William's court. They even campaigned together. Robert then decided to go to the Holy Land and participate in the First Crusade in 1096. But by then he was so impoverished from all the fighting that he was forced to mortgage his duchy to William to afford joining the crusade. On August 2nd, 1100, William was hunting when he was killed by an arrow. While William had many enemies, and some, particularly Henry, had much to gain from his death, most chroniclers at the time accepted that it was a simple hunting accident. Though conspiracy theories have abounded in the centuries since his death, historians have generally discredited those theories, as injury or death during a hunt was fairly common. Still, Henry would benefit significantly from that errant arrow. Henry moved quickly to seize his brother's throne, occupying Winchester Castle and taking control of the royal treasury. He was crowned 3 days later. Robert was still returning from his crusade and was in no place to press his own claim. Henry announced that he would correct many of his brother's unpopular policies, specifically William's treatment of the clergy and abuses of barons' property rights. To help secure his power, he also married Matilda of Scotland, daughter of the late King Malcolm III of Scotland and descendant of the West Saxon kings and Alfred the Great. Henry and Matilda had 2 children, a son named William Adeline, and a daughter who they also named Matilda. In addition, Henry, now King Henry I, had a number of illegitimate children with various mistresses. When Robert returned, he tried to press his claim to the English throne, but Henry had consolidated power by then. Henry easily beat back an invasion by Robert in 1101, and then Henry invaded Normandy, and in 1106 defeated Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray, and Robert was captured. While he didn't take the title of Duke for several years, he held Robert as a prisoner and administered Normandy, effectively controlling all of his father's former kingdom. The decades of war between the siblings following the death of William the Conqueror seemed to have come to an end at last. Although he seemed the least likely of the three, it was Henry who outlasted his brothers and consolidated his father's lands under a single ruler. And these lands that had seen so many years of war finally saw the prospect for peace and stability. Henry's rule is generally considered effective, as he maneuvered politically to strengthen his friendships and eliminate troublesome barons, eventually reconstructing the government to more fully rely on himself as king. Problems remained as other forces, such as the French king, Louis VI, threatened over control of the Norman duchy, as did another Norman neighbor, Fulk, Count of Anjou. But the politically adept Henry won Fulk's support by promising to have his son, William Adelin, marry Fulk's daughter, yet another Matilda. Henry continued to squabble with Louis VI until they reached an agreement in 1120, in which Louis accepted William Adelin as the rightful heir to the Duchy of Normandy, in exchange for William Adelin's homage to the French crown. Finally, everything seemed to be going Henry's way. His kingdom was largely secure, and no one had risen against him in England in years. He had humbled or allied with the major powers surrounding Normandy, and his heir at 17 was already helping to rule England with the assistance of advisors. He was even called Rex Designatus, or King Designate. Despite being called by one chronicler a prince so pampered that he would be destined to be food for the fire, he seemed to be meeting Henry's expectations. We know relatively little about Adelin, but he seemed to have been the center of a relatively hard-partying group of young nobles, as might be expected from a teenage heir. He married Matilda of Anjou in 1119. In 1120, Henry and William Adelin were sailing from France to England from the port of Barfleur. Barfleur was Henry's favorite place to sail from France to return to England and offered a fairly safe, easy trip of 10 to 12 hours. In Barfleur, King Henry was approached by a captain, Thomas Fitzstephen, the son of a man who had been captain of the flagship of William the Conqueror's 1066 invasion fleet. Thomas was the owner of a large ship called the White Ship, and wished to have the honor of taking Henry across the Channel to England. But Henry had already made other arrangements, though he did consent to allow Thomas and his ship to take William Adelin across, along with a large number of other nobles, including several of Henry's illegitimate children. One chronicler quoted Henry, "Your request meets my approval. I have indeed chosen a fine ship for myself, and will not change it. But I entrust to you my sons William and Richard, whom I love as my own life, and many nobles of my realm." Henry left early that evening, expecting Adelin and the White Ship to follow shortly after. According to the contemporary chronicler Orderic Vitalis, hard-partying William supplied the nobles and the crew of the ship with a considerable amount of wine prior to their departure. Perhaps sensing disaster, several members of the party chose not to sail, saying that they found the ship overcrowded with riotous and headstrong youths. Others left the ship as they were ill or because they were concerned about overcrowding, including one of William's cousins, Stephen of Blois. The White Ship was described as a square-sailed timber longboat. She was recently refitted and one of the fastest and most modern ships in the fleet. The party may have delayed leaving because they were confident the fast ship would bring them quickly to English shores. Vitalis claims that by the time they left, the ship was carrying some 300 passengers. In addition to the heir, one of the most powerful earls was aboard as well, the Earl of Chester, and many of his associates. At least 7 chroniclers recorded what happened next. Chronicler William of Malmesbury describes a group of priests arriving to bless the ship, common practice at the time, but they were chased off by the drunk revelers. He goes on to say that the crew began bragging that they could overtake the king's ship, and the passengers egged them on. A large crowd had gathered to watch the ship leave, sometime a little before midnight. Drunk and proud, the ship took off in the middle of the night, swifter than the winged arrow, sweeping the rippling surface of the deep, and straight into a rock just offshore. The ship was struck on the shallow rocks, and the crew attempting to free it using hooks, but as soon as the ship began to break away, so went the ship's hull, and it immediately began to sink. The crowd on the beach heard a cry go out, though there was little they could do, and most assumed it was merely the sound of the party on board. On the chilly November night, the passengers had little chance of survival. Dressed in thick, heavy clothing, drunk, very few of them would have known how to swim even in good conditions. The cold would likely have struck the struggling lords and ladies with cold water shock, which can cause immediate and involuntary inhalation, filling the lungs with water. It also constricts the body's blood vessels and makes it difficult to coordinate muscles. Most of the unfortunate victims would have died quickly. But there was at least a single rowboat aboard, and bodyguards quickly found the heir and deposited him inside. He and a very small number of people may have escaped, except that William heard the cry of one of his half-siblings on board, and began shouting at him about how awful it would be to leave his sister to die. William ordered the ship to return for her, and between the water and the struggling passengers, the little boat was overturned. William, his bodyguards, and his sister all drowned. 12th century historian Henry of Huntingdon wrote that William, instead of ascending a lofty throne, found his grave at the bottom of the sea. According to Vitalis, the captain was still alive when he learned that William had drowned, and instead of facing the king, chose to allow himself to drown as well. Vitalis wrote that the passengers and crew raised cries of distress, but their mouths were soon stopped by the swelling waves, and all perished together. We only know about the details of what happened after the crash because a single man survived. According to Vitalis, he was a butcher from Rouen called Berold. He clung to wreckage all night and was eventually rescued. The news spread quickly, but no one wanted to tell Henry. The king was rare in that he had recognized a number of his illegitimate children, and along with William, 2 of them had also died in the wreck. When the news finally did reach Henry, he was overcome. So sudden was the shock, so severe his anguish, that he instantly fell to the ground, but began raised up by his friends. He was conducted to his chamber and gave free course to the bitterness of his grief. The sorrowful king mourned for his sons, the flower of his nobility, and his principal barons. His son's death may have inspired Henry's construction of Reading Abbey, in its time one of the largest royal monasteries in Europe. Everything that Henry had built began to fall apart. He had no heir, and his wife had died several years earlier. With William dead, the alliance with Fulk of Anjou disintegrated, although his daughter-in-law remained at his court for many years. The peace with King Louis also died with the heir, and Henry was again embroiled in conflict and desperate for a solution to succession. He married a second time in 1121, but by the time of his death in 1135, failed to produce another heir. In 1125, Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor and husband to Henry's other legitimate child Matilda, died. Henry brought the empress home and declared her his heir, forcing his barons to pledge their allegiance to her. Matilda was married to Geoffrey, Fulk of Anjou's oldest son. Henry's attempts to salvage the situation, however, were all for naught. When he died in 1135, many of his barons turned immediately to Stephen of Blois, another grandson of William the Conqueror, who had so nearly died in the sinking of the White Ship. Crowned King Stephen, the next years were a long string of conflicts for most of 2 decades between Matilda and Stephen, in a civil war called the Anarchy. Many chroniclers spake ill of William Adelin, describing him as spoiled or insufficient religious or generally bad-tempered, but the truth of those stories is difficult to determine because it was common practice at the time for chroniclers to think up excuses for why God would allow something like the tragedy of the sinking of the White Ship. Some conspiracy theories have risen in the 900 years or so since the ship sank, but generally historians discount ideas that the ship might have been deliberately sabotaged, mostly because there's no good way that the ship could have been sunk deliberately without the saboteurs themselves being killed. Regardless, the sinking was a pivotal moment that would direct the course of English history. Eventually, after a bloody 18 years of war over the throne, Matilda and Geoffrey's son Henry II became king, beginning the rule of the House of Anjou over England, and the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry I was one of the most effective rulers of his time, but despite all his careful preparations for the future, history dashed his hopes upon rocks just off the coast of France. In 2021, divers found some wreckage near those rocks that appeared to be those of the White Ship. The chronicler William of Malmesbury wrote, "No ship that ever sailed did England such disaster." I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guide, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguide.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.